let me know. I'll start. So you're welcome to public session, and for viewers who may be watching our proceedings on Oireachtas TV, to the 5th public session of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action. We've received apologies from Alice Mary Higgins. Before I introduce the witnesses today, at the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that their mobile phones are turned off or switched onto flight mode. I'd like to extend on behalf of the committee a very warm welcome to Dr. Muireann Lynch and Dr. Kelly De Brún from the Economic and Social Research Institute, Dr. Tricia Keelty from the Society of St Vincent de Paul, Matt Collins, Robert Deegan and Eileen O'Connor from the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment, Jerry Kenny and Matt McGann from the Department of Finance, and Mr Jim Shear from the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. And before we begin proceedings, I just want to begin with some formalities. I wish to advise the witnesses that by virtue of 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such ways to make him, her or it identifiable. Finally, members are reminded of the long-standing ruling of the Chair to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against any person outside the House or an official by name or in such ways to make him or her identifiable. So I'll start with, because of the number of speakers, I'm asking you to keep your opening statements to 3 minutes, so it will allow our members to give you questions, to ask questions over and back. So I'll call on Dr. Muireann Lynch to make your opening statement. Thank you.
Hi, I'm going to find the 3 minutes challenging, so I'll try to skim the main points.
Thank you.
The appropriate measurement of fuel poverty is not a settled question in the literature. There are generally 3 distinct definitions. The first definition considers a household to be experiencing fuel poverty if they spend more than a certain percentage of their income net of housing costs on fuel, and this is typically set at 10%. The second definition considers modelled rather than actual spend. So in other words, the expenditure on fuel that would be required to meet a certain level of warmth, taking into account the household characteristics and the dwelling characteristics. And the third metric relies on subjective self-reported data, and it categorises a household as experiencing fuel poverty if they have difficulty affording adequate heat or fuel. And I just want to point out here that this relates to thermal energy only and doesn't cover the costs of public or private transportation. Choosing an appropriate measurement of fuel poverty from the 3 above is not straightforward, and the reasons for this are perhaps best explained by means of a simple example. And I want to point out here that these figures are purely illustrative. I'm not saying that these are indicative of anything that may or may not happen. The Murphy household is a low-income household that currently spends just below 10% of their income net of housing costs on fuel. They live in a poorly insulated house, they have a low-efficiency gas boiler, and they cannot afford one of the 11 indicators of basic deprivation, and I've attached a full list as an appendix to the statement. So that means they're not currently considered to be experiencing basic deprivation. Now let's assume that carbon tax is increased by some quantum that means that the Murphys, making no change whatsoever to their behaviour, now see their energy bills increase by €200 per year. Their household includes a small baby and an elderly relative, so they're not going to cut back on their heating costs, so they continue to heat their house as normal. But what they do is they cut back on social activities and they put off replacing worn-out furniture. So this means that they qualify for energy poverty under the first and the second definition. They do not qualify as energy poor under the third definition, but they do qualify as experiencing basic deprivation. Now let's assume instead that the Murphy family consists of a couple with teenagers. Instead of continuing to heat their house as normal, they respond to the increase in carbon taxation by switching off the heating in the morning. So instead, they leave the house earlier and they eat their breakfast at work or at school. So they don't qualify for energy poverty under the first definition. They do qualify under the second definition, and they also qualify under the third definition. And they're also considered now to be experiencing basic deprivation, because being unable to afford adequate heating is one of the criteria for basic deprivation. Finally, let's assume that they take out a loan from the credit union for €2,000 to invest in a more efficient boiler, and they pay this back at a rate of €21 per week. In this scenario, in order to pay this bill, they again cut back on social expenditure and they were put off replacing worn-out furniture. They now don't qualify for fuel poverty under the first or the second or the third definition, but they do qualify as experiencing basic deprivation. So the point I'm trying to make here is whether or not you're considered to be fuel poor depends on the definition you choose and on the household's behaviour. But no matter what definition you choose, they do qualify as being deprived. I'm going to skip over most of the research I was going to mention, but I just do want to draw attention to one paper by Dorothy Watson and Bertrand Maître of the ESRI, which found, looking at these indicators of basic deprivation and looking at data from Irish households, that energy poverty is not a distinct type of deprivation. So what that means is, if a household is experiencing energy poverty, they are also experiencing poverty. So in conclusion, energy poverty is difficult to measure, and the final determination of the extent and degree of energy poverty is highly sensitive to the definition chosen. So the research is clear that if you combine carbon taxation with appropriate revenue recycling mechanisms, the entire initiative can become progressive, and the poorest households are the greatest beneficiaries. So we would recommend that if you instead try to target poverty rather than energy poverty, it's a more appropriate metric. You ensure that you're covering all the households that may be affected by increases in carbon taxation, and recycling these revenues through the taxation and welfare system is therefore an obvious way of protecting low-income households. Thank you
very much. I know you felt you didn't have enough time there, but I will give you a chance. If there's any points that you want to raise through the over and back questions, just indicate to me and I'll let you in again. Thank you. I'm now going to move on to Dr. Tricia Keelty to make your opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. The Society of St Vincent de Paul welcome the opportunity to present to the Joint Committee on Climate Action on the issue of energy poverty. As the largest charity of social concern in Ireland, working to address energy poverty is a core aspect of our work, the solutions to which are closely related to tackling climate change. Our work across communities in Ireland demonstrates that energy poverty remains a major issue for large volumes of households. According to the Survey of Income and Living Conditions in 2017, almost 400,000 people went without heating due to cost. Last year, SVP spent over $4 million helping people with fuel and utilities, and approximately 70% of this expenditure was on solid fuel and oil. The combination of increased energy prices, poor quality housing and the persistence of low income significantly impacts on the households SVP is assisting. Low income households in rural areas, those living in social housing and private rented sector, and lone parent families are particularly exposed to the risk of energy poverty. And we are concerned about the impact of carbon tax increases on these households. As already outlined, research by the ESRI has shown that if the carbon tax is increased as it's currently designed, it will hit low-income households harder. Therefore, unless there's greater investment in income supports, public transport and energy efficiency schemes, low-income households will have to absorb these costs and they will be unable to switch to climate-friendly alternatives. Energy poverty will increase as a result. Just in terms of some of the schemes that are available to people who are experiencing energy poverty, I'd just like to give SVP's perspective on how well these are working. We're concerned that energy affordability persists despite the availability of energy income supports and without any further increases in carbon taxes. At current levels, fuel allowance is insufficient to meet the cost of energy for people on low incomes. An additional week of fuel allowance was introduced in Budget 2019, and this brought the payment to €630 for the winter months. However, it's still €200 less than 2010 in terms of purchasing parity due to cuts to the fuel allowance and subsequent energy price increases. Furthermore, fuel allowance is a highly means-tested payment, and if carbon tax increases and a decision is made to offset it through this scheme, many people experiencing energy poverty won't be compensated. And we note the ESRI research that suggests recycling revenues via the maximum social welfare rates and via tax credits for those who may be experiencing working poverty is the most administratively straightforward and equitable option. However, increases in maximum social welfare rates can't be at the expense of broader policy goals of reducing poverty and improving income adequacy for low-income households. In terms of the energy efficiency schemes, SVP has been very supportive of the Warmer Home Scheme, which is available to social welfare recipients who own their own home. The scheme may be a good option for older people who are homeowners, but for low-income households with children, it's more likely they're living in social housing or the private rented sector. SVP are concerned that if grants are enhanced without examining eligibility criteria or measures to support take-up over tenure type, it will not be an effective mechanism for protecting households from increasing carbon tax. Just in relation to transport, a lack of integrated public transport system in rural areas has a significant impact on low-income households' ability to afford a minimum essential standard of living. The development of the Rural Transport Scheme is welcome, however, sustained and increased investment is required. So just to conclude, overall it's clear that current schemes for addressing energy poverty are limited, and a large proportion of the Irish population continues to experience energy poverty. That's why Ireland needs an ambitious target to eliminate energy poverty by 2030. SVP would support the establishment of a Just Transition Fund in meeting this goal, and this would ensure coherence across Goal 1, No Poverty, and Goal 13, Climate Action of the Sustainable Development Goals. If Ireland is to be successful in addressing both climate change and energy poverty, the government needs to see both issues as being on both sides of the same coin, and critically of equal importance. Without addressing energy poverty, it won't be possible to meet our climate obligations, as energy poor households will not be unable to change their behaviour in response to measures such as increasing carbon tax. This will lead to longer-term social, health and environmental costs in the future. Our Budget 2020 submission proposals, which are included in Annex 1, include a range of measures that can help address energy poverty, and they include the provision of community energy advisors, increased investment in the retrofit of social housing, measures to support the introduction of minimum energy efficiency standards in the private rented sector, and investment in rural transport. So just to conclude, if energy poverty is eliminated, it will not only improve the living standards of low-income households, it will also upgrade the energy efficiency and quality of our housing stock, reduce health-related costs, and more importantly, help address climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll now move on to Mr. Matt Collins. Thank you.
As the committee are aware, the Department commissioned a 2016 modelling study which applied what's called an objective approach to measuring energy poverty. That research found that 28% of Irish households were in fuel poverty. In recent months, the ESRI applied the same methodology, and its analysts showed that the rate of household spending more than 10% of their income on heating now stands at 17%. A separate ESRI study also noted the strong correlation between energy poverty and basic deprivation. So a number of studies have already been undertaken by the department. But turning to the future, in order to address data challenges in relation to energy poverty, the Department and SEAI are participating in a CSO-led project to develop energy poverty indicators. It's anticipated that this work will provide valuable outputs in terms of informing future national policy and presenting key statistics in the public domain to further our understanding of how to alleviate energy poverty. We are also hopeful that it will also help us to focus energy poverty supports on those most in need. The project is ongoing, and the CSO have indicated that it will begin publishing reports either in late 2019 or early 2020. The committee are probably aware that there are a number of policy responses to address energy poverty. These include income supports, consumer protection, building regulations and efficiency schemes. But there's a strong rationale to help low-income households to be able to heat and light their homes adequately through dedicated energy efficiency support schemes. While improving energy efficiency of homes may not be sufficient to lift a household out of poverty, it can drastically and permanently reduce their energy needs in a way that income supports cannot. The key role of energy efficiency is reflected in the Climate Change Action Plan, and it includes an objective of retrofitting 500,000 homes by 2030. A high-level retrofit task force has been established, and a total of €3.7 billion has been provided under Project Ireland 2040 to support the achievement of this target. The Warmer Home Scheme is our primary grant scheme for households in energy poverty. It provides free energy efficiency upgrades to vulnerable households, making these homes warmer and more affordable to heat. Recent years have seen a significant increase in the funding provided for the Warmer Home Scheme. The allocation has increased from 15 million in 2015 and to now stand at 40 million in 2019. In addition to increased funding, the scheme has also been expanded to include deeper measures such as external wall insulation, heating upgrades and window replacements in worst performing homes. The eligibility rules underpinning the scheme have also been extended to encompass greater numbers of people. The Department has also funded the Warmth and Wellbeing Scheme, which is a joint policy initiative with the Department of Health, and this pilot scheme aims to investigate the health impacts of improving energy efficiency of a home. And since 2016, over 25 million has been invested in improving homes under this scheme. Other schemes administered by the SEAI, such as Better Energy Community Schemes, also provide high rates of grants for lower incomes. And overall, these schemes have resulted in over 140,000 homes receiving free upgrades since 2000. So, in conclusion, I understand the committee have the full text of the statement. Energy efficiency measures are central to addressing the root causes of energy poverty, as opposed to just treating the symptoms. The Department will therefore continue to improve how energy poverty schemes target those most in need, in line with our Climate Action Plan commitments. Thank you very much.
And finally, move on to Mr. Jerry Kenny. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Jerry Kenny. I have responsibility for indirect tax policy in the Department of Finance. I'm accompanied today by Matt McGann, who heads up the Economic Fiscal Analysis Unit within the Department. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the committee for the invitation to discuss the review of the public consultation on the uses of any carbon tax increase that may occur. Members of the committee will appreciate that we're a fortnight out from the budget, so we're not really in a position to comment in any shape or form of what the Minister may or may not do in the next 2 weeks. Having said that, Minister Donoghue told the Budget Oversight Committee last week that he's still considering his options. He did say, however, that if changes are to be made in carbon tax, the revenue from such a change should be treated in a different way from other tax changes that have been carried out. Separately, the Taoiseach stated earlier this week that all new revenues raised from carbon tax will be ring-fenced to fund climate action and just transition. And just transition to protect those most exposed to higher fuel and energy costs and for whom new jobs must be found. In the committee's report, Climate Change, a cross-party consensus for action, the committee recommended that the Department conduct a public consultation examining options for use of revenue raised from increases in carbon tax. In line with this recommendation, the public consultation was launched by the Department, asking a series of questions. A report of the responses received is set out in the Climate Action and Tax paper presented to the Tax Strategy Group in July. The consultation was conducted over the period 30th of May to 28th of June. A total of 66 submissions were received, 19 from private individuals, 28 from business and business representative organisations, 13 from the social, voluntary and community bodies, and 6 others. They were from political or public administration bodies, academics or academic organisations, including from some members of this committee. The predominant view from the public consultation is that the additional carbon tax revenue should be ring-fenced for the purposes of enhancing the current SEAI grant scheme for household energy efficiency improvements and to fund sustainable transport infrastructure. The majority of respondents favoured these 2 options, while most respondents were against the use of revenue for general government expenditure or to pay EU fines arising from failure to meet targets. Increasing the national fuel allowance to support those at risk of fuel poverty received a mixed response among all respondents. The option of returning the proceeds by way of dividend to citizens or households through the social welfare and/or the tax system received a negative response overall, being one of the least supported and most opposed options. The option to use additional carbon tax revenues for broad climate action purposes, in other words through the Climate Action Fund or similar, received a slightly negative response overall, most respondents stating their preference for a transparent and visible use of revenue arising from measures related to carbon change. The option to incentivise businesses to switch to more sustainable production measures garnered support among industry representatives and respondents, and limited support from other respondents. The results were published in the Climate Action paper presented to the Tax Strategy Group in July of this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentations. I might just start with both departments, Communication and Finance. It's disappointing from our committee's point of view. We, as part of our cross-party report, as you know, we worked very well over a number of months to broadly agree a cross-party approach in relation to how Ireland will tackle climate change. And in relation to the price on carbon, there was broad majority consensus in relation to setting that at €80 by the year per tonne by the year 2030. And we requested that a draft policy paper on the outcomes of the public consultation from the Department of Finance and a poverty review, that would be submitted to our committee by the end of July to enable us to make recommendations. And it seems that the departments have worked have given a disjointed representation here today, with the Finance talking about the public consultation in relation to how the carbon tax will be used, and the Department of Communication talking about energy efficiency. While that's all very positive, this is an all-of-government action plan, and I would like to know what is the collaboration between the two departments, between the Department of Communications and the Department of Finance, and when can we expect this policy document? Who would like to respond on that? Are we going to get this policy document in relation to poverty review?
Well,
the SRI, I think I very much welcome your input. So we have had information, but it just seems to be disjointed, and this is an all-of-government action plan, so we need a more coordinated response from all the different departments. So if you can explain how you're working with Finance in relation to this.
Well, I think it's because of the important issue that's been addressed here in terms of energy poverty, and the priority for us was to improve the data that we have in order to inform the policy development. So rather than, like a number of studies that I already referred to have been carried out both by the department through ESRI, and a number of subsequent studies have been carried out. And we have gone to work with the CSO. So the CSO are the National Statistics Office, who are best placed to develop the right type of metrics and the analysis. And they've undertaken to take a much more accelerated approach to making that data available. So what the response is then from us is that while we have undertaken studies in the past and they have produced results and results which has been conducted separately by other bodies as well, the key for us was to go to the national agency with responsibility for the statistics and to work with them together with the SEAI to provide the best sort of metrics that can inform that policy development. The challenge is, it is a difficult, complex area. You can see the wide-ranging policy measures that are already in place, and also the socio-economic factors that have been referenced by the SRI here today, how complex the area is. So it is important then, if we're going to make an intervention in this area, that we have the best data available. And that's why we are focusing, as just an initial step, is working with the CSO to develop those metrics.
And when can we expect those metrics? When can we expect the outcome of that in relation to, because we have a budget, we're all expecting an increase in the price of carbon, and we're looking at protecting those who are most vulnerable, the fuel poor, those in energy poverty. So we were expecting an analysis. Maybe the Department of Finance, what is the collaboration with the Department of Communications in relation to this, looking after those who are most vulnerable and ensuring that we're protecting those as we increase the price of carbon, as agreed by the majority of this committee?
Well, I suppose the department's role is revenue raising primarily, and we deal with the tax aspects of it. In relation to the request from the committee to hold a public consultation, we did that. The normal approach for us in terms of anything that feeds into the budget process is through the tax strategy group, and that's why that approach was taken. I think there's probably a wider collaboration through both departments' involvement and use of our colleagues in the ESRI and what they're producing. I know the Minister last year, when there may have been an expectation that he was going to do something on carbon tax in the budget afterwards, he said that he didn't feel he had enough information, he didn't feel he had enough analysis, and in that regard we went back to talk to the ESRI about further studies that are ongoing. I think the Department of Communications, Climate Action are in a similar position in terms of working with the ESRI, and all of that feeds into the final decisions that are taken by government.
So will there... Sorry, yes, thank you, Mr.
Maybe I'll
McGann.
just add that actually a portion of the work which the ESRI is doing is jointly funded by both departments. So Kelly's I3E model is primarily funded by the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Energy, but we also partly fund a subset of that modelling work under our joint research programme with the ESRI, and both departments sit on the steering group for that model.
Yeah, I suppose that's my question, and how you're all collaborating and working together, because one of the main issues here was that there wasn't this cross-departmental coordination in relation to climate change and tackling it. So is there a time frame in relation to a policy paper coming to us? Are you aware of when we would receive that?
Well, the first step would be, the first step, we're obviously working in partnership with the CSO in developing the data, and the first step would be, the intention would be that that data would be finalised and published towards the end of the year or early the start of next year, and that will provide us with more information at that stage. We then would be, in terms of ourselves, we would be undertaking a review of our own strategy to assess just what the impacts have been, and using both the results of that and the data that has been provided by CSO and ongoing data coming from the CSO, we will be developing a new strategy then later in the year.
Later next year, is it? Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to my colleagues here. So I'm using the format we used previously. Deputy Chambers.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you all for coming in for your presentations. So as it goes to, the questions are similar to what the Chair mentioned. I suppose what I want to ask is, when was the decision made not to follow the recommendations from the committee? It's clear the department has decided not to do what it was requested of it to conduct a poverty review. So can I ask, when was that discussed? Who decided that a fuel poverty review wouldn't occur? Who decided it would be outsourced or separated to another body? I'd just like to know that information.
Who would like to come in on that? Mr. Collins.
I wouldn't put it in such a context of like just refusing to do work. I think what we were looking at is that we have already undertaken work in this area, and rather than just ourselves carry on doing the same work again, we want to get what's the real added value is actually bringing in the real expertise. So there are leading academics both in the research institutes and also in the CSO. So drawing in their expertise is going to provide much more valuable data that can inform that policy development. Like as I said, we did carry out a study in 2016. That was the same methodology was applied again, and separate research was done by ESRI. So it really is, well, do we continue? Do we go on? Like, should the department carry out its own study while the separate work is going on in the CSO? And it didn't seem to be the best use of resources that would be in some way divorcing ourselves from what the expertise is doing in CSO. And again, the ESRI has an extensive programme which is ongoing as well. And as you've heard, like there is the funding comes from both departments, and there is oversight from both departments. So it really was an attempt to think what is the best way of getting the most value for money, getting the most useful indicators that can inform the policy. So it is working towards developing that analysis.
But do you accept that the recommendation from this committee was that before the end of July 2019, a joint policy paper should be prepared by your department and the Department of Finance on this very matter, and that has not occurred? And there seems to be very little direct collaboration between both departments on this. Can I ask, how often have both of Mr. Kenny and Mr. Collins, how often have you met about fuel poverty?
Well, I've been just recently transferred into the job, so I haven't had the opportunity to meet at this stage.
But just Mr. Kenny, perhaps the predecessor, have you met the Department of Energy or Climate Change on the matter of fuel poverty?
I would have met the department on a relatively regular basis over the last 6 months around the climate action plan. So a lot of issues would have been discussed there, but specifically on fuel poverty, no.
I suppose this gets to the crunch of where we're at with this. So a key recommendation around what we're talking about today and around the carbon tax issue is that there was a request that both departments develop a draft policy paper on the issue of fuel poverty, and then I suppose to measure the issue of a carbon tax to allow this committee and to develop a broader consensus. And it seems from what both of you have said, there's been a kind of a siloed approach. Mr. Kenny, you mentioned your role as being indirect taxation and analysing that. Mr. Collins, you've mentioned the CSO and external experts, but there's a serious deficit around, from our perspective, I think, about who's owning this within the departmental structure. And if at the first port of call we're seeing a failure on that front, how do you expect the public to accept a consensus around what might be announced on budget day when the work that's been requested of the departmental structures hasn't been prepared?
Do you want to move, Mr. Deegan?
I just want to point out that the engagement has been with Department of Finance and Department of Public Expenditure in terms of how the revenue could be recycled, and that's going to mitigate any impact of the carbon tax on people living in fuel poverty. So it would be us very much advocating for particular interventions to be made using the carbon tax revenue, because it's very difficult to measure the impact of the carbon tax without taking into account the ameliorating measures that will be brought in that the Taoiseach has referred to in recent days in terms of how the revenue is going to be hypothecated and it will be used to protect people from the negative potential impacts of an increase in carbon tax. So in terms of the interaction between the departments, Department of Finance, as Jerry says, is very much in terms of generating the revenue, but we've had discussions with Department of Public Expenditure and Finance in terms of how that money can best be spent.
I'm going to bring in Dr. Lynch. She just wanted to come in from the SRI on
Yeah, just if it's helpful to the committee, one of the papers that has been published this year by colleagues of mine in the SRI does include a table showing the extent of fuel poverty across various metrics under the first and the third definition I mentioned earlier. And it also calculated the increase in fuel poverty under a €10 carbon tax increase, not including any recycling options and not including any behavioural change. So just to give a couple, just two indicative figures, for all households under the subjective self-reported measure, 8.7% of households are in fuel poverty. Under the 10% of expenditure figure, it's 17.4%. So you can see the huge difference there. And that 17.4 moves to 18.1 under a carbon tax increase. And if we look at a retired single person, it's 5.6% under the subjective measure, 41.4% under the expenditure measure, and that moves to 42.8. So I suppose the only point I'd make here is the massive difference the definition you choose picks. But I can certainly give a copy of this paper to the clerk, and that can be circulated to the members. That would be helpful to you.
Thank you. That'd be very helpful. I'm going to. Sorry, Deputy.
Yeah, just final question. Yeah. When do you expect your work on fuel poverty to be completed?
Our work, I think we'll be working on this on an ongoing basis for a very long time.
Well, look. There's a recommendation here that a review be complete around fuel poverty. Surely there's going to be an outcome from that work. I mean, obviously, academics review lots of things all the time. When will the piece of detailed work that's been recommended from this committee be completed by your department? Or has it even been commenced? I suppose that has me worried about the original question. Have you commenced a process of examining the issue, or is there a generic kind of tracking of the issue? I just think it's important we clarify this, because as a committee, if the recommendations we've made around key issues are collapsing on day one, when we're meant to be formulating a consensus, it doesn't really fit with the high-level principled rhetoric we're seeing elsewhere around this issue. So I think it's important that we see outcomes.
Mr. Deegan. Yeah.
I think what you're making a fair point, but I would just kind of refer to the Climate Action Plan commitments in relation to this. And there is a commitment in that to reviewing the energy poverty schemes so that we can target those most in need. And there's a commitment that would be done by the end of the year. And this is about having a very practical impact on delivering change for people living in energy poverty. It's about making sure resources are going to those in need. We've got We've had significant increases in funding in recent years. That's continued this year. We want to make sure that that money is being used to best effect and we're getting best value for money and really targeting those in need. I'd also just point to one other thing. The NECP, the National Energy and Climate Plan, will also include by the end of the year, that's a report that's going to the European Union, energy poverty indicators and the measures that we're going to be taking to help tackle energy poverty in the years to come. So there's very tangible work that's ongoing at the moment. It's also going to be considered, as Matt mentioned in his opening address, the retrofitting task force that has been convened. That's a very high-level group that's going to be chaired by the Secretary General of the Department. One of the things that that group is going to be considering as part of its terms of reference is how we can bring people in energy poverty along in that 500,000 houses that we have to hit as part of our climate action plan target.
Thank you. Senator Mulherin.
We've heard the definitions, or the three definitions on energy poverty and how it's measured. And traditionally, as regards home heating and fuel poverty, looking at fuel poverty within the home, people are helped, of course, through the fuel allowance payment. But when you look at this definition, I would imagine that it's casting a net wider than just people on social welfare, that there's people on lower incomes that are going to be hit potentially by a carbon tax and really can't afford a carbon tax. And I'm wondering, in your discussions between the two departments, are you looking at this cohort of people who can be under serious pressure, who they won't be able to afford, in a lot of cases, to change their heating system, to take various steps, and they're very much tied into the fossil fuel, whether it's coal or oil. And in fact, in recent years, if they did manage to get a grant through SAI, it was an oil boiler, an updated boiler we know that they got. I'd be very concerned about this cohort of people, and that when we're describing energy poverty and helping people, we're helping people lower income earners and not just people on social welfare, who are obviously a clear category, and that there's people a step above that need to be looked after, or they're already under pressure. And I think it's fair to say, listen to a lot of people, that they're afraid of what's going to happen after the next budget and the carbon tax. The other issue then is, there's a lot of talk about, obviously just transition, but the different sectors and that they're going to be affected, and a general acceptance that people living in rural Ireland don't have the option of public transport. And while Rural Link and that is very welcome, you can't bring your children to school on Rural Link. You can't pop into town. You may not have broadband. And lots of times, obviously the ambition is towards battery cars, but I cannot see how these people are going to get their hands on battery cars for a long time to come. So there is a lot of general discourse about the fact that you have people, and in a lot of cases, these are pre-2008 cars, and people are paying big motor tax on them already, and they're going to be a further addition of the carbon tax. And I would like to know what conversation there is about helping this cohort of people who have been identified as will come under pressure. And I suppose there's just another question, maybe the SRI might have some information on this. We have an objective that we won't have diesel, no sale of new diesel or petrol cars from 2030 on. But at what rate do we need to be introducing battery cars into the market? And at the moment, as I understand it, approximately, say, even with grants, you could be looking at €40,000 for a battery car. But if you have people, and again I'm talking about rural Ireland, going around in cars that are valued between €3,000 and €5,000 and can't afford to change a car, like these people, their just transition, if we're really to support a just transition, is going to be going on for years. And if we don't address the issue now, that they have to travel and that they're going to be hit by this carbon tax more severely, they won't have a choice. They can't go on a dart. They can't do this, that or the other. Like, how are these people being accommodated in a real way, and how might we see it in the budget? And just going back, to the issue of the fuel poverty in people's homes. There's, at the moment, I understand, 1-year waiting list for the warmer home schemes. If funding is to be ring-fenced for the carbon tax, are we going to see more money going into the warmer home scheme, or are people going to continue to wait long lengths of time who seek to improve the energy efficiency in their homes, reduce their heating bills. A year is the current waiting list. And I'm just wondering, is that something being looked at, that you're going to increase the budget there? And just finally, I know, Mr. Kenny, you brought us through the public consultation there. At this committee, we are very aware of the various measures, many of which are reflected in the Government Action Plan, require the public to come along the journey with us. And I'm concerned that there hasn't been adequate public consultation. I'm not talking about on the financials. I'm talking about across the board, that first of all, that consultation would yield information that will bring us to a point to see what is bearable, what people can actually carry. I know we have the objective, we want to reduce carbon emissions. I feel most people have not been engaged with, the ordinary person has not been engaged with. There may be, I'm not taking from the public consultation that the Department of Finance undertook. My view had been that there was going to be road shows around, that people, there's lots of people saying we should be taking action, but there's a big cost here. And it's about making decisions, and I don't think people are engaged on that level. And we see in countries where they've taken these steps, whether it's in France, Canada, wherever, and there's been a big backlash where these things have been done, and it means they're not implementable. Thank you.
I might start Mr. Collins or Mr. Deegan, whoever wants to come in. Yeah.
I'll ask Robert then to respond to these questions.
Sorry, just to run through a couple of those. The people just above the threshold, I think, again, that's a good point. It's something that we are concerned about. There are a number of schemes available that are kind of tiered at the moment. So we have the Warmer Home Scheme that is available for people on certain social protection schemes, including the working family payment. So that's a payment that would be for families who might not be earning as much as other families, as well as job seekers and other payments. So it's not just people who are on those other payments. The Better Energy Home Scheme is another scheme that it doesn't provide as high a percentage in terms of support, but it is support available to families who may be able to contribute some way to themselves. But again, as I mentioned to Deputy Chambers a moment ago, one of the Climate Action Plan targets is to ensure that we're targeting the right people. Any decision to increase the eligibility threshold by increasing the amount of income that somebody could earn could have the perverse impact of meaning that the worst off in society might have to wait longer. So if in any kind of a budget constrained scheme, we're trying to target on those most in need. So by stretching it to people on higher incomes, that'll mean there's less to spend on those in the absolute lowest of incomes. You mentioned about the Warmer Home Scheme waiting list, and that is a scheme that waiting list is increasing. You're correct again. The reason for that is because the measures that are available under the scheme have been expanded to be deeper measures. So every person who's getting that scheme now is getting deeper interventions that cost more money and also take longer to do. And we also expanded the range of people who were eligible to apply for the scheme also. So you had made the scheme more attractive, and we made it more open to more people. And the impact of that is that demand has increased, and there has been a significant increase in the budget. This year it's gone up to almost 40 million euros now for the Warmer Home Scheme. So it's about continuing to look at the way the scheme operates to see if we can tweak it and improve it in terms of how it's targeting, and at the same time seek additional resources for it so we can tackle that waiting list.
Using the carbon tax, it would be a possibility of using the carbon tax towards this.
Well, that was one of the things that came out quite favourably, as Jerry mentioned earlier, in the public consultation, and it's something that our department would support. You also mentioned kind of public consultation and in terms of selling the whole climate agenda, and that's something that our Minister Bruton has been quite strong on. He's been all around the country. I don't know how many roadshows he's done at this stage, but there's been at least 5 or 6 roadshows that he has personally attended all over the country, and so he's been certainly getting out and about and trying to sell the message. And just on the just transition also, there's a whole section in the climate plan on just transition, and there's a range of actions as well. So it's something that hasn't been overlooked. and it's something, again, that the Minister feels quite strongly about, making sure that cohorts in society that could be negatively impacted are protected to the greatest extent possible. And I think the Taoiseach's recent comments have been very supportive in that regard.
I'm going to bring in Dr. Keelty. You wanted to come in on this?
I'm just to agree with share your concerns in terms of the targeted nature and the means-tested nature of the fuel allowance. It will miss a large proportion of people if carbon tax are recycled through this scheme, particularly working poor households and households with children. Approximately 40% of the poorest children, those in receipt of a qualified child increase, are living in households that don't get the fuel allowance. So if carbon tax are offset through that scheme, you're going to miss a whole range of people who are experiencing energy poverty. And just in relation to the warmer home schemes, as we mentioned in the opening statement, they're a good scheme for people who are on a low income and own their own home. But we know that energy efficiency is particularly poor in private rented sector and in social housing. So the commitments in the Climate Action Plan around deep retrofits of social housing is really welcome, but there's a significant challenge in relation to the private rented sector. So we would like to see action plan in terms of introducing minimum energy efficiency standards in the private rented sector so that those households are able to access grants, and whether that's through incentivising landlords, an awareness campaign, or some way of linking it to security of tenure as well. So, for example, if you allowed landlords who agreed to let their property to HAP tenants for a 5-year term, that they could access some grants as well to actually compensate for that. And just in terms of the measurement discussion, we have a lot of information on energy poverty. We have the subjective measures in EU Silk, that's collected annually. I understand the household budget survey will now move to an annual collection as well, so we'll be able to track energy poverty in terms of that expenditure method. So one of the recommendations we made to the National Climate and Energy Plan was that there would be a baseline energy poverty measure set for this year, because the current strategy to combat energy poverty ends in 2019, and we don't know what will succeed that. So that's really important to say as well. So what we said for the climate, National Climate and Energy Plan was that you have a baseline set with both the household expenditure method and with the subjective method, and then you'd set a target to actually eliminate energy poverty by 2030. So it would work alongside our climate action targets as well. So that's something that we've been advocating for.
Thank you very much. I might go on to the next.
There's one question
yes,
not answered. How are people in rural areas who won't have access to public transport, on lower incomes, how are they going to be protected? Bearing in mind, I just described, I can't see for years that they might be able to afford a battery car.
Who would like to come in on that? The rural Ireland element. Yeah.
Well, actually, the transport sector is really an important one and a challenging one. And it's a mixture of regulatory steps, taxation and subsidy policies that are being implemented there. And over time, the expectations from the global analysis is that the cost of vehicles and the cost of operating electric vehicles is going to come down to the same level as internal combustion and become cheaper. I think they're cheaper to operate as it stands at present, but the challenge is the buying costs at the moment, and that's why we already have subsidies in place to help reduce the differential pricing between an electric vehicle and an internal combustion engine. So, and we intend to continue to work on that.
Collins, the cohort of people I'm talking about, I mean, they'd laugh at you for even thinking they'd afford a battery car. I'd like to focus on the people who can't, who have a car worth 3,000 to 5,000 now, or whatever, and they're in a country area and they're bringing their kids to school. They're trying their best. How are we going to be protecting these people?
Thank you.
And of course, those vehicles are going to be replaced over time. So we're not talking about an immediate requirement on families.
But the carbon tax is going to be brought in the next budget, an increase in it.
Okay.
But what I was saying was that there's a range of measures that we are taking to achieve our climate objectives in the transportation sector, not just taxation. And another example from a regulatory point of view is the role of biofuels, and that'll be in the vehicles that people are using at the moment to improve the carbon intensity of the transportation there. So there are a range of options rather than one single option in terms of addressing that factor. And the other thing that we're looking at, again, I know you you have concerns about EVs being the solution and the impact it can have on families. But again, we're supporting the rollout of the network of EV charging points, and that's to provide reassurance to people in rural communities as well, that there will be sufficient charging points and mobility will be maintained in rural areas as well. So it's a suite of actions that we're taking that address both the climate issues, but also we're very conscious that there are interim steps that can be taken that don't have as much an impact on lower income rural families as well.
Dr Lynch, I'm going to very brief, and then I'm going to go to Deputy Stanley.
One thing, just to reiterate, what all the research from the ESRI has shown is that if you recycle the revenues through taxation and the benefit system, everybody is better off, all cohorts across all incomes. Yes, they're paying more on their fuel because of the carbon tax, but they still have more money in their pocket if you recycle the revenue appropriately.
But I'm asking, how is that going to be done in that particular scenario to protect that cohort who don't have public transport?
There's a range of options outlined in various ESRI papers, and I'd be happy to send them on to you.
That would be very helpful.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Deputy Cullinan.
And with a number of colleagues, so there's only one round, is there, of
Yeah, if you want to share the 10 minutes, no problem. Do you want me to let you know?
You might just let me know when I have 5 minutes left, so I'll take 5 minutes. I don't see much evidence, Coherlock, of joined-up thinking from the two departments. Department of Finance, Mr Kenny, said that they're focused on raising revenue and on indirect taxes. I don't see any joined-up thinking in terms of the departments looking at increasing carbon taxes from the perspective of reducing people's carbon footprint and changing people's behaviour. Our focus is on exactly that. It isn't on raising revenue. There's lots of different ways in which we can raise revenue, but the whole purpose, my understanding of the purpose of the carbon tax, is that we actually change people's behaviour, and I'm not convinced that that's what the departments are actually looking at. So, first of all, if I could just say to Mr Collins, has the department looked at carbon taxes, done a study on whether carbon taxes, from your perspective, are progressive or regressive?
Mr Kenny, is it, you mean?
Mr Kenny, yeah.
Okay.
I think of the evidence that we have seen from the SRI and others is that it's regressive.
It's regressive.
Yes.
So what you're saying is that you want to continue with a regressive tax, increase the carbon tax, which you yourself acknowledge is regressive.
Well, I think, to be fair, Deputy, this committee has recommended an increase in carbon tax.
I'm not asking about this committee.
I think you need a little bit of context.
Kenny finish, Deputy, and I'll let you back in. Let him respond.
The committee has recommended an increase in carbon tax, as you quite rightly say, to bring about a change in behaviour. They've also recommended a trajectory out to €80 per tonne. The Climate Action Plan has a similar trajectory in place. The Department of Finance deals with taxes on their merits, and they see what sort of can be done. Our tax strategy group papers outline options and policies around a whole range of taxes, including carbon taxes. That's
okay,
what the
Mr.
department
Kenny,
does.
what you've acknowledged is that the carbon tax is regressive. My focus is on reducing carbon footprint, reducing carbon emissions and changing people's behaviour, which I believe should be done by providing alternatives. So if I can give you just two examples of, say, two people. One is an older person who is in poverty, or is maybe a person who is deemed to be in fuel poverty. So if you increase the carbon tax on that person, what analysis has either department done on the options that older person would have to change their behaviour? What advice would you give to that? How could they change their behaviour? If the department or the minister increases the carbon tax, you're talking about an older person who has a home that's heated by oil or gas. What can that person do to offset the cost of the carbon tax increase?
Again,
or change their behaviour?
This is more our colleagues in the Department of Climate Action, I presume, would deal with it better than I could. But the Minister and the Taoiseach have already said, as I said in my opening statement, that any additional revenues raised from a carbon tax will be treated differently to revenues raised in the normal course of events. In other words, they won't go into the exchequer for general expenditure measures. So, if there is an increase in carbon tax, there will be revenues available, is what the Minister and the Taoiseach is saying, to encourage people or to mitigate against the increase in carbon tax for people who are in fuel poverty, for people who have transport deficits, as Senator Mulherin talked about. That is my understanding of what this committee has recommended, that the idea that we have a trajectory in place to tell people that this is coming and we now need to change behaviour. But at the same time, within that trajectory, you have a revenue-raising mechanism that will provide revenues to do just that.
But Mr Kenny, my point is, and I think you're missing my point, that may well be the case, and I'm not sure, nobody knows how much the Minister is going to increase the carbon tax by or how much revenue it will raise. We can already do the type of things you're talking about through general taxation, if a government so wanted to do so. What you're saying is that at some point in the future, if we raise enough money through the carbon tax, we can then put in place these mitigating measures and people may have the alternatives. At this point in time, they don't. So the same for a person who lives in rural Ireland, maybe the other department can answer this. If you live in a rural village, and I live in one, there's no bus runs through the village that I live in, none whatsoever of any description, how does that person offset the cost of the increase in their petrol or diesel? How can they reduce or offset the increase and change their behaviour? Maybe the department could answer that one.
Dr. Is it De Bruyne or Dr. Lynch wants to come in first, and then I'll bring in the department after. Is that okay? On this, was it on this particular point? Yes.
Yeah, so our research does show that people do reduce their carbon usage in the short run, so even without taking into account long-run investment measures. It is the case that energy is the least responsive to a change in price, but there still is a bit of a response there. We can't really get into the nitty-gritties of what they actually do, but Kelly's team has looked at what happens at an economy-wide impact.
Yeah, I think that I'd like to mention here is that I understand a lot of vulnerable groups will be challenged by an increase in the carbon tax, but I also think it should be considered about what proportion this actually is. So if you look at it, even if we increase the carbon tax to €80 a tonne, that corresponds to a 10% increase in energy prices. So we're not talking about that on budget day suddenly energy prices are going to double. It's small incremental increases that can initialise changes in behaviour that can be later supported by other support schemes. So I think it's important to consider that it's not like suddenly tomorrow we can have double prices.
But there's also an argument that, and I think a more reasonable argument, because I think it's actually unhelpful that the entire debate is framed through carbon taxes. I would argue that the best thing we could do is actually provide the alternatives for people and then allow them to make the transition themselves if they're not there. So maybe if I could put this to Ms Keelty, because if you're somebody who's suffering from fuel poverty, if the carbon tax goes up, you might well change your behaviour, but it might be because you can't afford to
Your
heat
5
the
minutes
home.
are up.
So the reason for a change in behaviour might not be because you have an alternative, it's because you can't afford it. So would you, from your perspective, the people that your organisation would engage with, do they have the means, so whether it's a pensioner or whether it's somebody who's on low pay, do they have the means
briefly, and then the
to
department.
make the
okay, thank you,
changes
Deputy
which are
Conlan, you've gone
necessary?
way over your time. Yeah.
For people on very, very low incomes, purchasing a heat pump, purchasing an electric car is just not an option for them. So in that transition phase, there needs to be protections there for those households who may be worse off as a result of an increase in carbon tax. And I understand the ESRI research shows that the best way to do that is by increasing maximum social welfare rates and tax credits for those in low-paid work as well.
I'm going to bring in the department now briefly, just to wrap up this.
Just really briefly, yeah, we agree with helping people to make the change. And in terms of your example of the older person that's living in fuel poverty, what we would suggest that person would do is to avail of schemes like the Warmer Home Scheme. That means that they can tackle the root cause of the problem in terms of reducing the energy consumption in their house, increasing the comfort and decreasing the associated bills for their energy.
Deputy Stanley.
Yeah, just if the answers could be kept brief.
Yeah, because you've only a few minutes. Yeah.
But I hope you just give a little bit of latitude, because it's obviously a very important meeting. This. Could I ask Mr. Kennedy from the Department of Finance? 5.17 billion was collected last year in energy taxes, pollution and resource taxes, and transport taxes. Carbon emissions didn't go down. What leads you to believe that? And 435 of that was directly in carbon taxes. And in the 10 years that we've had carbon taxes, our carbon emissions haven't gone down. Are you still of the belief that our carbon emissions will reduce if we jack it up another €20 per tonne, or €40 per tonne, or to €80 per tonne? Just a yes or no answer, maybe from Mr.
McGann,
Kennedy.
I think, wants to come in on this. Yeah.
With respect, Deputy, I don't think constitutes a yes or no answer, because the fact is that the economy has grown extensively over those 10 years, and carbon emissions grow when the economy grows. So the real question is the counterfactual of how much higher carbon emissions would have been if we hadn't had the carbon tax in place.
So it'll decrease if we increase those taxes, even though to date it hasn't. And carbon taxing specifically over the 10 years, even when the economy wasn't growing, showing that we haven't reduced emissions.
Dr.
Could I ask a question?
To come in on that question, I think, if you want to let.
No, I find that that's the department that wanted the question on it.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Just in relation to the Department of Communications and Energy, there's 497,101 private rented homes in the state. The people in those, some of those are paying 60% of their income. We know that from research helpfully provided by some of the other panellists here. And the bodies that you represent who are doing useful work. Some of those households are paying up to 60% of their income on rent and household costs. Those people, do you feel that the landlords who own those 497,000 homes will transition in the next year or 2 years or 3 years? Do you think it's possible that we'll have them to do a transition into really super A-rated homes, or even indeed B-rated homes, because they are the lowest, and we know this from being around them, that they are the lowest energy rating, houses. Certainly in my constituency, I've been in flats and apartments and rented houses that are ice boxes from October straight through into April. Do you think that will happen within a 2 or 3 year period?
For time-wise, yeah.
How is it going to be done?
This is a problem that's seen all over the world in terms of rented properties not being as energy efficient as other properties. There was an advisory group established in 2018 to look at the best ways to improve the efficiency of the rented sector. And the objective of the group is to identify the appropriate policy interventions while keeping in mind any potential adverse impact on the supply of rented accommodation, because that's the absolute last thing that we'd like to do in a constrained housing environment at the moment. So the group will be publishing a public consultation paper in the coming months. It'll definitely be before the end of the year. It could be in the next month or two. And the intention is that would feed into discussions around how we can tackle the efficiency of rented properties without diminishing the supply of rented accommodation.
Just mention one thing that you might feel
Very
into
briefly, your time is up.
That, there was a bit of latitude given to the previous speakers, but if we just mention that a lot of the occupants of that private rented accommodation are the lowest paid workers. Also people who are on social welfare who are not entitled to fuel allowance. Well, it's been mentioned before that we'll give people this, that, or their tax credits. A lot of these people who I know are not even earning enough to get tax credits because they're on the minimum wage. So what will happen to that cohort while the consultations and while everything else is happening? We're talking about what we're trying to point out here today is there are real situations where people are going to be caught in huge poverty traps and in huge fuel poverty traps. And we just highlight as well the position of farmers whose income is 10 and 11 and 12,000 a year. There's a cessation of turf cutting. A lot of areas turf cutting isn't available anyway, and what was never available. Those people are going to be caught. And I just think that we hear about reviews, we hear about studies, we hear about everything else. Out in the real world, those 497,101 households, there's a huge cohort of them that are facing freezing cold winters that have gone through them. But in the future, if these carbon taxes are loaded on, a lot of them will suffer from hypothermia.
Have you anything? You're okay. Okay, I have to move on for time. I'm now moving on to Deputy Breach Smith. It was 10 minutes. Sorry, I thought it was 2. I didn't know it was the 3 of you coming in.
We're very short. We're just.
You've gone way over the time. I bring in Deputy Smith, and
one previous speaker went for 17 minutes. One previous speaker went for 17 minutes.
I have it here marked down. You went way over the 5 minutes there each, both of you. I'll just bring in Deputy Smith, and I'll try and get.
Thanks very much. The discussion, I think, is very interesting, and I particularly welcome the evidence from Vincent de Paul and the ESRI. But I go back to what Deputy Chambers said earlier on about priority recommendation number 3 from Chapter 6 that we worked hard and long hours to get agreement on, which was that this government would conduct a poverty review, a fuel poverty review. Can you just please answer me yes or no that you have ignored that? Instead of obfuscating, as you did in 2 or 3 PQs which I've given you over the summer, please give the public a yes or no answer that you're not and had no intentions of conducting a poverty review. I then want to ask you about priority recommendation number 4 from the same chapter. And that priority recommendation, you may tell me now if you've done anything about it, was that the Department of Finance commissioned an inquiry into the revenue that could be realised through the introduction of a carbon tax on the profits of corporations and firms directly linked to the production and sale of gas, oil, coal and other related fossil fuels. Have you any intention of conducting that inquiry and trying to establish how you could ring-fence profits on industry for dealing with climate change? I want to ask the RSI, if you get a chance here, to repeat those figures you gave us on how energy poverty is measured and when you move from one band to another. I'm particularly fascinated by the figure, depending on the criteria you use, that energy poverty among retired single people moves from a low percentage right up to 42.8%, because that's my experience as a local TD. My clinic is packed every day with pensioners trying to access the grants that I'm being told are available, warmer home schemes, retrofitting and all the rest of it. It isn't there for a lot of pensioners who may be in receipt of a tiny occupation-related pension. It isn't there for pensioners who are in receipt of fuel allowance but don't suffer from COPD or a lung-related disease. They may be crippled with arthritis, they may be going blind and be freezing cold all the time, but they're not getting any help. They're told not to even bother applying when it comes to schemes that are supposed to help them to alleviate. They're worried about the increase in carbon tax. It does incentivise them to say, I'd love to get new windows, I'd love to get solar panels, I'd love to get the house retrofitted. They cannot access it, and they don't have the 40 or 50 grand up front to say, there's my contribution to doing up my home, now give it back to me. It doesn't work like that. There is a cohort of Middle Ireland caught in the middle, and it includes very critically the travelling population, and the Traveller MABs carried out very serious research into this. Very critically lone parents, pensioners, working people who are low pay, of which most working people are in this country. So we are witnessing a farcical exercise where we're told by Mr Jerry Kenny there his job is to raise revenue through indirect taxation, and then we hear from the others that there's no real facilities there to help people who are going to be impacted by this carbon tax. And yet I'll just remind all the members of the committee that the vast majority of this committee recommended a carbon tax. And one question to the Department of Finance. We don't know what the Minister is going to put the carbon tax up by, but let's say he put it up by a £5 a tonne. Would I be right in saying that that would raise about 108 million? Or if he put it up by a £10 a tonne, that would raise 216 million? And how far do you think that is going to go to help the most vulnerable people change their behaviour, improve their lives and get them out of fuel poverty? Seriously. And will you please undertake that exercise that priority recommendation 4 asked you to do? Look at how we can tax the profits of the fossil fuel and related industries, ring fence that tax so that they don't pass it on to the poor again, and use it to undo the damage that they've done to the climate and to the planet.
Will I bring in Mr Collins first?
Thank you, Deputy. So just in relation to the query about the review, the recommendation by the committee on the reviewing the extent and nature of fuel poverty and also the most appropriate measure. At the outset, I gave a very brief summary of the opening statement, and the opening statement explains that a review of fuel poverty was undertaken by the department in 2016. More recently, then, a similar study was carried out again to give an estimate of fuel poverty. So there are 2 studies have been taken place already, and the ESRI is the most recent one. And in terms of the issue of what is identifying the most appropriate measure, I also outlined that in my opening statement that we are, along with the SEAI, we are working with the CSO, the State's National Statistics Agency, who are best placed to inform us and use their expertise in terms of identifying the most appropriate measure to be used in that for fuel poverty, which will further inform policy developments and developments of our schemes.
I'm still not getting an answer. Yeah. And it's real problematic and I've asked you these questions in writing and I've got nothing back but obfuscation. Are you going to conduct a review of fuel poverty in this country or not? You haven't done it, we know that. Are you going to?
What we would suggest kind of covered the extent of fuel poverty was covered by the DSRI study, and I don't know whether they wanted to say anything on that. They used a similar methodology that was used in the 2016 study. So using the current measure of fuel poverty, that was published in the report of June by the DSRI.
You had other questions for...
I didn't ask the RSI, I asked the department.
You had other...
We gave this recommendation as a climate action committee across all parties, and it's been utterly and totally ignored. And yet, the recommendation to increase the carbon tax was contingent on that review.
Well, the department would never, well, we wouldn't generally undertake that kind of detailed analytical work ourselves. We would generally outsource it. The 2016 review was outsourced to another, it was a consultancy firm on that occasion. But we rely on the expertise of outside organisations such as the ESRI and the CSO.
And just to add as well, it's because the expertise of the ESRI is in its databases and understanding the socioeconomic impacts and to be able to understand the different income groups within society as well. So they're best placed to carry out that work. So as I said, a study was undertaken in 2016, and another study has been completed by the ESR in 2019. But we are continuing the work, and we're working with the CSO, which is ourselves and SEAI, to improve the indicators that are there, the indicators on fuel poverty.
So just one comment. It's utterly frustrating. I understand, and I've heard the ESI and the Vincent de Paul, and I've heard MABS, I've heard Traveller MABS, I've heard Age Action Ireland. I've seen their stuff. What you were asked to do was review all this. You can use their empirical evidence and their material, review all this and give us back a report. And you failed to do it. And within days now, the Minister is going to increase carbon tax in the absence of the department doing this piece of work. I'm not asking you to repeat what these women have done, the good work that they have done in Killaton, where fuel poverty lies, how you measure it, the extent of it, possibly the extent of it, because it isn't an absolute yet. You were asked to give us a report, and you've utterly refused to do so. Now, can you please answer what you're going to do with priority recommendation number 4? Which is to give us a measure of what potentially could be raised by a tax on the profits of the fossil fuel and related industries.
Probably finance, sorry. The short answer is, Deputy, my apologies, I don't know what is being done, if anything, on that recommendation, but I would suggest that, you know, companies like those are subject to corporation tax on their profits in the normal course of events, and they're subject to every other tax that's applied across the board.
And the loopholes that go with them.
In relation, you also asked about the increase. If the Minister were to make an increase, yes, the figures you have are broadly in line with what we would expect to raise in terms of an increase in €5 and €10 a tonne. In relation to the mitigating factors, I mean, our tax strategy group paper will set out what the mitigants could be, but as I've said in the past, or as I've said here earlier, you know, these are matters for decision of the Minister and the Government in the context of the budget as to how, if he does decide to increase carbon tax, what he will do with the revenues afterwards.
We need to sort out public transport, home retrofitting, just transition, all that's needed with 180 million. Fair play to him. Hats off to Pascal for achieving all that.
Well, again, I mean, it is a long-term project. You know, the committee has talked about going out to €80 a tonne by 2030. That generates a significant amount of revenues.
Okay, well, with respect to you, Mr. Kenny, as the official responsible for indirect taxation, I think we've just proven that this is a punitive tax on the worst off in society without actually achieving anything to mitigate climate chaos. I've just one question to the
Oh yeah, very briefly, because I have to move on.
So the differential between the subjective and the objective measure is there's a couple of things going on there. So let's say you are spending a huge amount of your income net of housing costs heating your swimming pool and your sauna. You know, you technically qualify under definition A as fuel poor, but you're not going to answer that you have difficulty meeting your fuel bills, which is why you don't qualify under the subjective measure. The particular differential for retired single people, I mean, we don't know why 35.8% of them are spending more than 10% of their income on energy and yet aren't reporting that they have difficulty meeting their bills, but presumably it's because their income is such that the remaining 90% is that they can meet their living costs in such a way that they don't feel they can't afford their energy bills. I think the cohort who you're particularly concerned about almost certainly fall into the 5.6% who are reporting that they have difficulty meeting their bills and they also can't access these grants. So I would just again reiterate the point that actually measuring fuel poverty is very difficult and targeting fuel poverty is very difficult, but measuring poverty and targeting poverty is possibly a more salient policy measure that might be one that the committee would like to consider.
I have to move on to Deputy Ryan.
People know my own view. Oh, sorry, Essentially,
yeah, I was going to bring you in after after Deputy Ryan, actually, for the next, It's just that I would appreciate, just in future, for my own, it'll help me as well in the running of it, if there's 3 going to share 10 minutes, let me know. I thought it was 2 deputies, sorry, 2 who are going to share it. That's for, I didn't know the 3 of you wanted to get in the 10-minute slot.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, we won't lose head over it. Listen, I just welcome again on the record that this increase in carbon tax is considered a regressive tax. As a party, Sinn Féin, we didn't go with it in the report, and I think there was one other, Reid Smith, we didn't go with it. Just going back to probably the Department of Finance, this is for 450 odd million was collected in the carbon tax on a yearly basis. If it does increase by the small amount that is being lauded about, that will bring it to about, I don't know, I'm not good at maths, but about 600 million. 600 million, can you correct me if I'm right, is that the cost of our fines for not meeting our targets and ambitions next year? Where's that going to come from? Are we going to rob it out of this, perhaps? I don't know, but if we could have an answer to that. I think also it is very punitive. We need to look at the housing emergency that we've got. And people in Dublin in particular, and everywhere it's gone up, are paying over the odds on their rent or their mortgage. They don't have, the heating has gone up, the electricity, everything that we have is all gone up. It's unsustainable then to be seen to be so punitive that we're putting on an extra tax on them and asking them to give more when most of them earn average wages, and the people that we would represent just average two to 2,500 per month, and that's eaten up really, really quickly. The other question, and I am being quick, this is the last one, is also perhaps for St Vincent de Paul and the Department of Finance. You aware when somebody becomes unemployed, they're not eligible for the fuel allowance until they have been in receipt of benefit for 390 days. So that's 2 long winters. If you become unemployed next month, say, 2 long winters before you can actually be eligible for, and that's such a, I suppose, discriminatory anomaly there. And I wonder if anybody, if the St Vincent de Paul have any experience in dealing with it. I certainly have. One last one, Matt Collins. Since 2016, over 25 million has been spent on the Warmth and Wellbeing Scheme, and very welcomed in my area, Dublin 8, 10, 12, and the Tala area. But it's 25 million over, say, 4 years almost, would be come in just over 6 million. So it seems like a paltry amount. What is the actual average cost, and how many homes have actually benefited from the Wealth and Wellbeing Scheme? We know public health, and we've heard it today with the pollutants in the air, premature deaths, or worldwide, Ireland 1,200 people in 2016. So I think it is definitely underfunded, and are there plans to increase that? But also, how many houses does that actually represent if it's average 6 million a year over the last 4 years? Thank you.
I might start with the Department of Communications and those. Yeah. Are you
in the process
do you want a minute?
of
Okay.
the figures.
St. Vincent, anyone else want to come in on those? Yeah. Dr. Keane.
Just on your point around the weight that you have to, before you can receive fuel allowance if you come unemployed, one recommendation that we've had to the Minister for Employment Affairs and Social Protection is, for example, if you can expand that, close that gap for people, and also make fuel allowance available to those in receipt of the working family payment, because there's a lot of people who are working and struggling and can't meet their energy costs as well. So there needs to be a broader base in terms of that particular cohort of people as well.
Yeah, it just seems very cruel.
Yes, Dr. Lynch.
Yeah, just ESRI researchers found in the past that the fuel allowance is particularly poorly targeted, and so that means two things. It means there are families who receive it who aren't experiencing fuel poverty, and there are families who don't receive it who are. Just wanted to put that on the record.
Thank you. And our department ready? Mr. McGann, do you want to come in? I might give you another minute, Mr. McGann, to come in.
Just quickly, so yeah, you're right, Deputy, that we take around 450 million at the moment, or sorry, Senator, in carbon taxes, and the ready reckoner amount is about 105 or 110 million per €5 increase. I'm afraid I don't have the figure with me at the moment for our fines, unless colleagues in the Department of Climate Action know it. I can get that to you and send it on.
You're the money guys. Where are you going to get them paid?
Just let him finish. Yeah. Just let him finish.
Well, what I do know is that the amount is, in relative terms, relatively small, because you're actually able to bank your unused allowances. So we banked a lot of allowances in the earlier years of the decade, and you're allowed to carry them forward into the later years of the decade, so they offset or overshoot on the carbon in the later years.
Mr. Collin, I'm going to bring the department now, just conscious of time.
Just in relation to the query about the expenditure and number of houses on the warmth and wellbeing scheme, the approximately 1,200 houses have been upgraded under that scheme. And these are approximate figures. The average cost is in the region of 20,000 per house.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to go to Deputy Ryan. Thank you.
I know that my own perspective for this is that we should be introducing a carbon and dividend model where we return any revenues raised to the citizens on a per capita basis. We held a very interesting workshop in the Audiovisual Centre here during the summer, where we brought in Catherine Harrison, a leading academic from Canada, to share their experience, the likes of Cara Augustenberg from UCD School of Environmental Studies, Graham Caswell, Carbon-Tide, and Barra Rantry from the ESRI. And the analysis from that workshop is that it works, that it does work, it does change behaviour, not as much as maybe we might want, marginal, but not an insignificant marginal. It was the best way of addressing income inequality. It seems that their analysis was clear in that, and that the way you would do it would be through a social welfare increased payment, or social welfare direct payment, and a tax credit direct payment to someone's bank account. It wouldn't be a cheque in the post, as much as we like to get a cheque in the post. It would be a direct payment, which we were told from the Department of Finance was administratively doable, would be very cheap. All the data sets they have would make it viable at very low cost pretty much straight away. So I'm very keen to see that as an option. I'm very pleased, Ms Lynch, when I read your presentation and heard you speak here today, when you said this, as I understand, the SRI analysis is we examined the impact on total income inequality and found that combining carbon taxation with revenue recycling actually reduces income inequality relative to a business as usual scenario. This is in addition to the reduction in carbon emissions that has come about as a result of the tax increase. So, can I ask you first question, did you make a submission to the Department of Finance's consultation process in the summer that they held on this issue?
On the revenue side?
Yeah.
Yes, we ourselves, along with Barra, myself and Kelly did, yes.
Would it be fair to say then that the ESRI is broadly supportive of that, if I'm reading that sentence correctly, that it is actually an appropriate policy measure? It meets what you just said in that sentence.
Yeah, you will find your carbon taxes go down, and your carbon emissions go down, and if you recycle the revenues appropriately, You can undo any regressive impacts, and you can actually reduce income inequality.
It's an intelligent economic approach.
Well, that's the economic impact if you
socially
do it that
justified.
way.
It's not up to the ESRI to determine whether a policy should target inequality or not, but if you want to target inequality, you need it.
In all this session, there's an awkwardness because that's absolutely true, and what Professor Seán Sherlock said is true. This is a political question. The allocation of resources is ultimately our job, and it's very difficult for department officials in the sense they're getting the political, wish we had the Minister of Finance here, because this is politics at its absolute core. But we have the St Vincent de Paul here, and again, Ms Kilty, I was very reassured when I read your submission. It is the St Vincent de Paul's view that increasing the fuel allowance alone will be insufficient to compensate for increases in the carbon tax, and other mechanisms to protect low-income households from carbon pricing should be examined and included. This may include recycling the revenues via tax and the benefits system as proposed by the ESRI, which is found to be the most equitable option and administratively straightforward. So am I reading to that the St Vincent de Paul would also see that this tax and dividend model does help, as you said consistently throughout your presentation here today, help address the core issue of poverty and income inequality?
I suppose, just to be clear, in our submission we said that we would favour investment in measures to tackle energy poverty in advance of increasing the carbon tax, but if the carbon tax is increased, that we would favour recycling revenues via maximum social welfare rates and tax credits. Now, I suppose what's important for us to say here is that while some people may not be worse off after that recycling process, they might be slightly better off. There's still going to be people Vincent de Paul members are visiting who have the heat escaping through the windows and the ceiling. Their children are having respiratory problems. They can't afford to put a fill of oil in their tank, and they're reliant on solid fuel. So what we're saying is that we need to start seeing measures to tackle energy poverty as part of the solution to climate change. At the moment, we're seeing it as just a barrier to climate action, but it needs to be seen as part of the solution, and we have to see some of the measures that we've proposed as being part of that climate action movement as well, and that's really important. I
absolutely agree, and there's such a job ahead of us, and the scale of it is beyond compare. The revenues from the carbon tax won't do it all. We're going to have to use a large amount of other money, targeting exactly as you said. But the St Vincent de Paul, in terms of where there was a choice, let's say, as you seem to be saying, whether if it's raising the fuel allowance as a mechanism of tackling, using the revenues from a carbon tax as a way of one of the tools to tackle fuel poverty and poverty in general, if you had a choice between that and the tax and dividend model, where it would go back as a payment in the form of increased social welfare and an increased tax credit, that would be preferable for you from your perspective.
Yeah, and I suppose, to be clear, the fuel allowance has to increase because it hasn't taken account of recent energy price hikes due to wholesale costs increasing, and we also see the impact of the PSO levy. That's probably a discussion for another day. But I suppose in terms of compensating for any increase in the carbon tax, which we would say only if we would ideally like to see measures implemented prior to that, but if it is increased, that the fuel allowance isn't the most appropriate mechanism to do that.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I ask Mr Kenny, can you provide me a list of the 66 people who engaged in the consultation process, and will you show me their submissions?
Yes, we can. Now, we did undertake, I think, when we issued the consultation process, or we did say when we issued it, that under FOI we would probably be obliged to make them public. Generally, though, we redact names, and there are quite a number of submissions from individual citizens and things like that. So I think our plan was to publish them on the department website. We just haven't had the chance to do that redaction thing. But I can give you a list redacting for the individuals so that you know the bodies and the organisations that have come to us. I can do that very quickly.
Could you give it to me tomorrow?
Yeah.
Thank you. You were asked, in a sense, to consider between the two options as set out by this committee. One was between returning it in grants payments and other carbon SEAI-type measures, which is what some colleagues here were supporting, and the other option was the dividend, carbon dividend. You presented in the consultation process 9 options. Why did you do that?
I believe, Deputy, I think we at the time we looked at it and we thought there were more options out there, to be perfectly honest. So we felt that for the wider purpose, we should include just more options that we identified and that had been identified.
It was a 16-page document, roughly, wasn't it? I remember reading it. I was reading it again. Roughly, whatever, 16 pages.
Probably not that big, to be fair. No.
There was no explanation whatsoever of the carbon dividend model in it. There was no sharing of the ESRI analysis, no sharing of the international experience. It's a very complex subject that people are very sceptical about. Why did you include no explanation whatsoever of one of those 9 options, which was one that we specifically wanted you to consider, that the Taoiseach supported at the time? Why did your consultation docket look at just about everything else, but said absolutely nothing about the carbon dividend model?
Well, we didn't give an explanation for any of the options that I recall. We just put in the list of options, and it did include a tax and dividend option.
There's one line in the whole document.
There's one line for every option.
But
there's my recollection, sorry.
There's 16 pages of analysis, no analysis on one of the core questions we were asking you, and the consultation was about to inform some members of the public who know nothing about this idea or this concept or the detailed analysis of the VSRI had done it. It looked and read like the Department of Finance wanted to kill this at first base because, as you say, you're a revenue-raising department, you like to hold on to the revenue.
That's a terrible accusation to make at the department.
Oh, God, I've done worse.
That certainly wasn't our intention. It wasn't our intention to kill any option. We tried to put as many options on the table as possible to see what kind of feedback we were getting. I have to say, we were very interested in doing the consultation process because it's something that we don't do an awful lot of, sort of in the space that I'm in, certainly in the department, and to get the feedback. And we were slightly disappointed, I suppose, with the reaction. We got 66 responses, which is low, I think, by any standard. But it certainly wasn't the intent to kill off any option. What we tried to do was give as much background information as we could around carbon tax generally and its impacts and things like that, without trying to favour or get into or do a disservice to any of the particular options.
I don't mind being any critical department, your officials, because, as I said, it is a political thing in a sense. But I do have to say, hands up who'd like a grant type of consultation survey and coming back and saying, oh, the worst option of all is a carbon dividend, where there's no analysis done whatsoever or presentation of the options. In fact, there's a whole range of other options thrown in. It's not the most scientific or qualitative piece of research or consultation process that I've seen. But I'll finish on this.
No, I agree, Deputy. And to be fair, it's very hard to base anything on 66 responses either.
Yeah, it's not. It's of no. Yep. I'm very glad that the St Vincent de Paul and the ESRI are supportive of the broad approach, and I hope that the Minister of Finance is listening, and indeed other parties who've now left here who have been the main advocates of an alternative approach. I'd love to hear anyone else answer the argument that this dividend approach is the best income inequality, poverty reduction approach we can take.
Bring in Deputy Pringle.
Thanks, Chairman. Chairman, I suppose, as you may recall, I was opposed to the increase in carbon tax recommended by the JOCC report last March, and I voted against it, but I voted in favour of the overall report. And I have to say that today's discussion here has actually reinforced me in my objection to it, because I was concerned that basically it would be given too much licence to the government to increase carbon taxes, increase taxes on vulnerable households, and against a backdrop of failure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or anything like that there. And there's 3 departments represented here today, and maybe I'm naive or that there, but does anybody actually talk to each other? Or does actually, is there any actual single policy pursued by each department, or does each department operate in its own silos and just operates and does its own thing and then throws it out there? And I mean, you talked earlier on about that you were funding the ESRI to do some report, and the Department of Finance was funding the ESRI to do some similar report, but nobody was talking to each other. It seems nonsensical to me. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm naive, and maybe that's it. But it seems crazy. Like, I mean, from what I'm hearing in this committee so far today, and I think it justifies why we shouldn't have increased the carbon tax, because I don't think we're getting a coherent talk about what is actually going to happen with it, and I think that's very disappointing. I suppose there's no real question in relation to that. Like, I mean, there's nobody to actually give an answer anyway, because you're all three departments and you're all three equal maybe areas, or what, or I don't know. Or
Mr. Kenny.
Maybe, sorry, and I don't want to compound any preconceived ideas you have here at this stage, but maybe, you know, the carbon tax and the approach to carbon tax, particularly in the last year or 18 months, has probably been a little bit different in terms of our revenue-raising activities from the Department of Finance perspective. In the past, the Department of Finance collected the money and the government decided how it would spend it. There was no hypothecation, there was never any real suggestion that it should be reserved for particular activities. So that's the starting point. You have to remember that, to be fair. But in relation to the carbon tax, there has been significant discussion going on, you know, as to what mitigants can be put in place, what's already in place, and there is, you know, sort of significant mitigants in place against carbon tax and in the area of fuel poverty and things already. But, you know, the Minister and his government colleagues would constantly discuss issues such as, you know, what do you do if you raise carbon tax? What do you do if you raise... In relation to any tax, that conversation does go on, but to a greater extent in relation to carbon tax, I think it has taken place. And maybe we're not putting ourselves across as well as we should here. But there has been, you know, sort of a lot of work in this area looking at what the impacts are going to be. And as I said earlier, the Minister himself, you know, he more or less said after the budget last year that he wasn't in a place to raise carbon tax because he wasn't happy that he understood all of the impacts. And that's, all of that work has been going on between ourselves, between the ESRI, between the Department of Communication and Climate Action, so that, you know, it's maybe, as I say, we're not explaining ourselves well enough.
Well, that work is going on, so how long is it going to go on for? Because we were here, supposedly this work was supposed to be completed and presented to the committee so that we could take a view in advance of the budget, so that that could feed into the budgetary process. But then today, I think we've been discussed that some of the work might be finished early at the start of the new year, and that'll be feeding into the processes through the year. So it could be June or July before the Department of Communications is ready to formulate an opinion in relation to that work. So we maybe, obviously we are being naive because we preempted this whole discussion by 8 or 9 months at least. By our report, and maybe our report is naive over it, and maybe you could explain that situation as well. But, so in reality, this discussion that we're having now should be having 12 months from now. Is that right?
What the Deputy is saying, I suppose, is that we were of the understanding that we're going to have a review paper that would inform us as a committee to make a recommendation in advance of the budget in relation to a number of issues: fuel poverty, how that revenue would be used or how it should be allocated. So we don't have that as with information here. And as you say, Mr. Kenny, maybe you just haven't. Maybe it's been done, but it's not I suppose the optics here today is that it's not done in a coordinated way. We don't have that document in front of us, and that's what we had expected here today. But maybe the work is happening, and we can hear, I suppose, statistics and facts coming from the ESRI, St Vincent de Paul, and yourselves. But just from it's important. I think Deputy Pringle has expressed it very well. So I don't know, Mr. Collins, it's important that you understand what we are looking for from the departments, this coordinated approach that will help us in our cross-party work here to help you implement this all-of-government plan and to make sure that we protect those who are most vulnerable and those who are going to find that transition hardest. But we need that information to work with.
And I accept your point of view and disappointment of what's been provided. And probably the format is slightly tricky because we come here as three different, or well, two government departments, or 2 or 3 government departments that come here, and we're usually being held account for the activities that we're undertaking. But and that's how we've presented it here. But I think it's also important just to recognise the amount of cross-departmental work that has been taking place during the preparation of the climate action plan was really phenomenal. Like it was driven at a very breakneck speed and under like huge time deadlines by the Minister right across the system. And structures have been put in place to ensure that there is an all-of-government oversight approach. And it's the nature of implementation then that we've been assigned different actions under that areas, and we're very much focused then on implementing those actions that are set out in the action plan. And perhaps that's where we've been overly focused at the moment. But there's ongoing discussions at official level, at many levels, both in terms of implementation, decisions being made on what are the different options. The pre-budget process is also an intensive period where all departments, including ourselves, will be liaising with both the Department of Finance and Department of Public Enterprise on options. And I suppose at this time of year, it's very limited in terms of what we can say as officials, because no formal decisions have been made, and the budgetary process is confidential until the budget day. So we probably haven't been able to convey the level of interaction that takes place between departments on these issues. Although I do acknowledge and apologise for the disappointment in terms of not being able to provide the information that you had hoped to have in terms of making your own decision making and feeding into the process.
So basically, you're doing a lot of work interdepartmentally at the government level. There's an awful lot of work going on there, discussions around climate change and everything like that there. So really and truly, you don't see the committee here as part of that, or as part of that process, or anything, or that you have a responsibility to talk to us, or or anything. So we don't. The committee doesn't figure in that. So you are working away. I'm not saying that you aren't doing work or anything like that, or that isn't useful work or that. But the problem for us as a committee is that we can't get access to anything, and maybe we're talking to the wrong people as well. Maybe that's the other side of it. Do you think maybe we should be working away independently and devising our own stuff? So I'm just wondering. Maybe we're trying to get at is, do we fit into the process? Or do we factor in the process, or are we an annoyance for you to have to come here today? Because certainly that's the impression I got from previous department officials who'd been here during the process of us drawing up the committee report and stuff like that. They didn't really want to know us, so I'm just wondering, where do we fit into the whole process, or maybe that's...
Well, look, absolutely. Look, there's absolutely no annoyance about being invited here, and it's always an honour to be invited to attend and present. But I would say you're probably addressing a really big issue in terms of the Oireachtas, and I know there's been investment in the Oireachtas in terms of their own budgetary and financial capacities to inform into the budget process. So it's actually probably even bigger than the specific issue we're just talking about here today. But we have an obligation. I work to the Minister, and the government has set a number of objectives that have to be delivered. And that's what our obligation is in terms of to deliver, ensure that give advice to the Minister, and then the decisions are implemented. And we are happy to come here and account for the activities and actions that we're taking. But I can see where you're coming from in terms of the challenge, in terms of the interaction between the Oireachtas and the government in terms of evolving and developing fiscal or policy options as well. It is challenging, and it's evolving. And I think you probably see that yourself in terms of the new resources being brought into the Oireachtas itself.
So basically, we're probably asking us the wrong questions and taking the wrong viewpoint on it.
I would just point to that the actual climate action plan was very heavily influenced by the work of the Joint Committee as well, the Joint Oireachtas Committee. So you would see.
We don't know that.
Pardon me?
We don't know that. Sorry.
I'm going to have to move on. Sorry to Senator Alice Mary Higgins.
Thank you very much. And again, apologies that I wasn't here. I have read all of your statements, but the wildlife bill, which related to peat extraction, a very relevant issue, was taking place at the same time. But I've read all of your statements with interest. From my perspective, I think the phrasing that needs to be used is actually about the cost of carbon, rather than simply looking at things in relation to the idea of a carbon tax, because it is about the cost of carbon, and the fact is that carbon has immense costs. The costs of carbon are manifested in the climate change, in all of those impacts of climate change affecting many of the most vulnerable people in the world. I know that I've met people from Malawi, from Bangladesh and others who are already experiencing the costs of carbon. And that is the cost. And the fact is that the cost of carbon the cost in terms of the environment, the cost on vulnerable people, has not been reflected in the price of carbon, from my perspective. It has simply not been reflected, and that is because the costs and the damages have been socialised, in that the costs that people are carrying in terms of the damage the carbon has done is being paid for either by individuals, sometimes in terms of their health, sometimes in terms of their lives, but also in terms of governments. The idea that the government will deal with the flooding risk, the government will engage in, governments worldwide will deal with the mop-up, they'll deal with the displacement of large numbers of persons, with land that no longer becomes arable, with all of those consequences. All of those costs have not featured in the discussion about fossil fuels as if they are solely a commodity and been traded in the commodity market. And that's for me why I kind of fundamentally come to this point of, I do believe that the cost of carbon the price of carbon has to reflect more of the cost of carbon. So the price must reflect the cost of carbon from my perspective. And I think then the question for us as legislators and as a committee is to say, when we have a realistic cost on carbon, how do we ensure that the most vulnerable in society, all of them, that everyone in society is not affected by that realistic price being put on carbon, that we don't have the most vulnerable persons affected? And that's why sometimes I don't like all of the narrative around that this is a kind of a stick to poke people into behavioural change. I believe it's a lot more serious than that. It's a lot bigger of an issue than that. I don't believe it's simply a matter of, certain taxes that get introduced as a penalty for somebody to kind of as a slap on the wrist. It's a matter of the price being very serious. In that regard, I believe we do need to ensure that all of those revenues that are coming from that going back into the public sector, that they are used to take serious action in respect of climate change. And I note, I do regret, I think it's sometimes the case with summer consultations, that there is a very small number of consultations, but I do note that a majority seem to have favoured the idea of sustainable transport infrastructure or of household energy improvements. And in a moment, Mr Kenny, I might come and ask you to comment, but I'll link it to another question, in terms of people realising that these are socialised and common risks. I have a concern in relation to the dividend argument, and I'd like the perspectives of Vincent de Paul and of ESRI in relation to that. As I understand it, the dividend proposal would only go to those who have managed to reduce their household energy bill. And reducing of your household energy bill is something which is not necessarily easy to do if you are in a local authority housing. And this is that issue which was mentioned around the fact of the retrofitting of local authority housing. There's also the question, if you are a private renter, if you are renting, perhaps receiving rental supplement or HAP supplement from the government, you are not necessarily in a position, will the dividend or the rate go to the owner of the house? Will the cost come? Where does that cost come? Where does that dividend come? And that is a very serious concern that I have in relation to those issues. I think I agree that fuel allowance in itself and fuel poverty are not. I think fuel poverty needs to be considered. Fuel allowance is not the only mechanism. I'd be interested from ESRI perspective, if they believe we should look at poverty, are they talking about consistent poverty or risk of poverty? My concern would be that consistent poverty may end up being too high a bar, because it can be difficult. And I would concur with Deputy Smith. I worked in Older and Boulder, and I talked to older people who used to sit in supermarkets all day long because they couldn't heat their home. And that is a reality for many older people. Again, will those older persons feature in the dividend model? Perhaps they would benefit from a fast-tracked or accelerated investment in retrofitting every home that the state can. And I think things like that should be a priority. My very last point, and again, this is back to you, Mr Kenny, but of course I absolutely welcome comment from Mr Deegan or others on this, but this is a very small amount of money. And we should not regard this as revenue raising to deal with climate change. For me, it is again about carbon pricing. I'd like you to really strongly come back, and I think it's crucial, with priority recommendation 4 in chapter 6 of this committee's report, the question of a levy on the profits of fuel and related industries. Because we need a timeline on that. If we are going to ask the public to start turning off their light switches because we want to reflect the real price of carbon, similarly we cannot allow companies to continue to absorb
Those questions
massive
were raised. Some of them were raised already. I'm just conscious again of time.
Again, but I'd like a direct timeline in respect of investigation of that issue. I think it's a deeply concerning, particularly given the new licences that are being granted in that regard.
Keelty, would you want to come in first?
Yeah, I would just like to respond in relation to kind of other measures that we can maybe implement in terms of protecting people from future energy price hikes. So obviously energy poverty is determined by your income, the energy efficiency of your home, and then the energy costs. And we've talked a lot about the income side of things and also the energy efficiency, but in terms of prices, we know that prices are increasing, and Ireland has some of the highest gas and electricity prices in Europe, and one of the main reasons for that is our reliance on imported fossil fuels. So as we move to more renewable forms of energy, we might see a decrease in prices. But in the interim, I think it would be really important to explore the option of introducing social tariffs into the Irish energy market, because in other European countries they have protections, price caps for people who are on very low incomes for any future price hikes. So that would be something Vincent Paul would particularly be interested in progressing in terms of that. I'd also say just a more broader point on the issue of climate justice. We're fully aware that poor communities across the world are more likely to experience the negative impacts of climate change, and the fact that the 10% of the wealthiest people in the world contribute to 50% of our carbon emissions means that we really need to consider how a tax on consumers is in proportionate to tax on the fossil fuel industry, and particularly those who are engaged with high polluting activities. The aviation sector comes to mind in terms of the lack of carbon pricing in relation to that. So that's just something that's really important to say, that if we're really concerned about climate justice and a just transition, we need to look at those particular aspects of carbon emissions and make sure it's proportionate. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to come in next there in any order? Yeah, Dr. Lynch.
So the dividend model, we would call it something different, but we looked at different ways of recycling the revenues to households, but none of them were contingent on reducing energy expenditure.
Okay.
And so what we found was we've various pieces of work. Some of them consider behavioural changes, some of them don't for technical reasons. But what we found is whether or not you take into account behavioural responses to carbon taxation, you can make everybody better off, you can redistribute the revenues in a progressive manner. And that applies whether or not you have short-run or indeed long-run responses.
So you were saying that this should be a blanket increase in social welfare rates and a blanket tax credit?
There are plenty of options that we've gone through in the various papers, and again I'll be happy to forward them all to the committee, and there was a summary document of the 3 pieces of work in this area that I attached to my statement as an appendix. I don't know if you received that, but I'd be happy to forward that on as well. The devil is in the details here, but the point is at the broad level you can make everybody better off whether or not they respond. But the point is, if they do respond, then they do get this extra benefit in that they're no worse off financially than if they didn't reduce their carbon consumption, and if they do, then they're better off again because they're saving money on their carbon and they're getting money through the recycling mechanism whichever one is chosen. Sorry, yeah?
Yeah, no, just so it seems to me then that it's just an individualised kind of bonus that is coming out rather than being in any ways time to you know, from my perspective, is a collective challenge, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, the way I think you characterised it perfectly, it's about making the price of carbon reflect the costs of carbon. At the moment, when you decide to consume anything, you weigh up the costs of paying for it versus the benefits of consuming it. At the moment, for carbon-related goods, you're weighing up the benefits of consuming the good against the financial costs to you only of paying it. If you include the carbon price, then you're weighing it up against the financial costs to you and the environmental costs, because instead of imposing the environmental costs on the economy, the people in general, you put that cost back onto the person who's actually buying the carbon good or consuming the carbon good. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I still feel concerned that that option, the benefit that accrues is in relation to your usage of carbon fuel. But this is maybe perhaps, and coming to Vincent de Paul again, the fact of those who are in private rental situation, for example, and those who are in local authority housing, if it's not retrofitted, don't have choice potentially, or the same level of choice in relation to the level of carbon that they are paying, and the compensation that is coming is kind of going to everybody, but not necessarily going to those, to them being in a situation whereby they can change the level of carbon that they consume because it's not directed, for example, as was, I think, encouraged by many who replied, and perhaps Mr. Kent, to report things like retrofitting.
So just one sentence. Like we have repeatedly said, a carbon tax alone is not going to cut it. It has to be in combination with other measures.
That's where I was going to bring in the department in relation to that, or SCAI. Jim, if you want, this is your.
Like I know there was the senator had was talking about that issue about the local authority homes, and I suppose the way we're approaching it, there is that issue about the carbon tax and what the implications will be for those individuals, and that's why there's a programme under the Department of Housing and Planning to retrofit local authority homes. Now, it's the scale of the challenge is big there, and I think that at this stage, about 70,000 homes have been completed under the programme, and I think they spent around in the region of this year. They've probably provided for approximately 25 million, I think, in terms of retrofitting this year. So there is a programme there. So
are you expecting a doubling of that next year? If I don't mean in the coming budget, a tripling.
He can't say. I'll speak for you there. Go ahead, Mr. Hollins.
So it was just, but it recognises that issue that there are stakeholders who the carbon charge doesn't necessarily drive an incentive, but they may get benefits, and that's why it can't be done in isolation, and that a number of measures have to be taken place, and that's where a large, from our department's perspective, the energy efficiency is such an important step in terms of addressing the broader issue.
Okay, I'm just conscious of time. Anyone else want to come in? Mr. McGann.
Just very briefly, and I think, Senator, you're exactly right, as Muireann said, about your classification of the problem being the difference between the cost and the price, and it's in economics what we'd call negative externalities, that your own actions or the costs are borne by other people. But just to point out, there is a difficult policy trade-offs in how the funds are used. The more you use the funds to directly recycle to households to target the progressivity issue, the less funds you have available to put towards emissions-reducing initiatives. So I'm not here to offer a view on what's right or wrong, but that is a policy trade-off.
And just in relation to that exact, the need for other revenue, the tax on the profits of fuel and related industries, the timeline for delivery of that, which was again a priority recommendation of this committee. That's part of that cost and price.
Sorry, Senator, I don't know the short answer. It's not in my area, so I don't know what, if anything, has been done in that space. But we can find.
But you would see the relationship between that, and it applies to the same argument, that same question. The issue of if the profit is taken in one area, but the cost, as you say, and the externalities are being borne in another area, I would say that the case is very strong for an increased levy on those areas. Or would you agree?
Dr. De Bruin, do you want to
I just want to react to that. I mean, I understand the point you're making, but you must remember that the energy industries fall under the EU's blanket of climate policy and are levied with ETS prices. So I think that that's something that needs to be considered as well.
You know that there is a trading scheme in relation to their productions, but the question is of specific levies around specific industries. And for example, the aviation fuel tax is one that's been raised, continually, that question of that. There is a question of the contribution that needs to be made to the change. And I think it would be unrealistic as well as unfair if we expect that the consumer in the day-to-day and that every citizen of Ireland simply in their payment and their bills is going to somehow fund the large-scale transition. So I think it is, and it is an issue that has a wider European, but also Ireland is part of Europe and part of those discussions. I mean, it's a reparational issue, to be honest, as well. Not simply for the future, but in terms of the damage done in the past, to be honest.
I'm going to give you the final word.
Yeah, I think, to be fair, Senator, you're right in the sense that the aviation sector certainly is beginning to come under the spotlight a little bit in that space, and There is sort of conversation starting at European level. Up to now, sort of aviation fuel has been exempt in terms of tax, in terms of excise duty at EU level. So I think that's something that is going to be discussed by the incoming Commission, and there will be looking at options in that space, I suspect. But it's kind of outside our remit for now.
Well, just in terms of licences that are being issued in terms of oil and fuel exploration, I mean, there's questions there as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to leave it there, and thank you all very much for coming before us this afternoon. We're going to adjourn our meeting of this joint Oireachtas committee. Thank you. Sorry, yes. Sir. Yeah, we're going to try and find a date for tomorrow because there's not too many left here. We're going to try and find a quick window tomorrow, if that's okay, just to have a brief discussion on it, because I don't want to make a decision here today when a lot of members are gone. Is that okay? Thank you. The committee is adjourned.